She texted me, "We need to talk at 9:47 on a Saturday morning." I was already parked outside her building. I had been parked there for 11 minutes, engine off, keys still in my hand, working up to getting out of the car. I looked at my phone, and then I looked at her building, and then I looked at my phone again, and I sat there in the specific way of a person who has just received information that rearranges everything they were about to do. Except in this case, the rearranging was mostly internal, because externally, I was still sitting in a parked car outside the building of the person who had just texted me, which was either a remarkable coincidence or a confirmation that whatever we had been carefully not talking about for the past several months had finally decided to happen, whether either of us had given it permission or not. Her name is Priya. She is 30 years old, and she teaches middle school science in the same neighborhood where I live, about 6 blocks from the apartment building I was currently sitting outside. I am 32. I'm a civil engineer for the city, which means I spend most of my professional life thinking about what happens underground and what happens when things built to last don't, which is a job that rewards patience and the ability to sit with uncertainty longer than is comfortable, qualities I had apparently been applying to my personal life with considerably more thoroughness than was useful. We had been friends for 14 months, not the kind of friends where the friendship is what it is and nothing more, the other kind. The kind where the friendship is real and good, and also contains something else entirely that neither person has named, because naming it changes things, and both people are, for different reasons, not sure they are ready for things to change. The thing with Priya and me had started the way those things usually start. At a building event I had gone to, out of obligation rather than interest, one of those organized neighbor gatherings that large apartment buildings occasionally produce in an attempt to create community, in a place where community has to be specifically manufactured, because proximity alone doesn't guarantee it. She lived on the 4th floor. I lived on the 7th. We had passed in the lobby a handful of times in the previous 2 months. The way you pass people in a lobby when you live in the same building. Acknowledging, occasionally nodding, occasionally not. Both of you moving through a shared space, without the space particularly mattering. At the building event, she was standing near the window with a glass of wine, explaining something about deep-sea thermal vents to a man who appeared to be politely trapped and professionally outclassed. I stood next to the food table, eating chips with no particular purpose, and I heard her say the phrase, "spontaneous generation of chemosynthetic ecosystems," in the complete and unself-conscious way of someone who forgets that not everyone has spent significant professional mental energy on this topic. And I walked over and said, "I think what you're describing is the hydrothermal vent communities that were discovered in the late 70s, and she turned around with an expression that recalibrated itself in real time from slight surprise to genuine interest. And she said, "You know about hydrothermal vents?" I said, "I'm a civil engineer. We think about what's underground. It's professionally relevant." She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "That is the most attractive sentence anyone has said to me at a building event." And then she appeared to realize how that sounded, and added, "Professionally speaking," and I said, "Of course." And she said, "Obviously." And we talked for 3 hours about infrastructure and marine biology and middle school students who were genuinely disturbed by the idea of things living without sunlight. And by the end of the evening, I had her number and an invitation to come to her classroom sometime if I wanted to see the tank. She kept in the back corner with 3 different species of deep-sea adapted invertebrates, which was the most specific and best invitation I had received in recent memory. I went to see the tank 3 weeks later, on a Friday afternoon, after her last class. It was a beautiful tank, maintained with the focused attention of someone who considered it part of the curriculum rather than a decorative feature. She explained what was in it with the same unself-conscious expertise she had applied to thermal vents at the building event, and I listened with the specific quality of attention that, if I had been paying attention to myself rather than to her, I might have identified earlier as a signal worth examining. We got coffee afterward at the place on the corner and talked until the coffee place indicated it was closing by the progressive dimming of its interior lights, and then we walked back to the building and she said, "Same time next week?" And I said, "I'd like that." And she said, "Good." And we went to our separate floors, and I stood in my apartment for a moment, thinking about the specific warmth of the 3 hours that had just passed, and deciding, without quite deciding, Not to do anything about what that warmth indicated, because the friendship was good, and I did not want to miscalculate and lose the friendship, which is the reasoning that seems correct when you apply it, and which costs you, in my case, approximately 14 months. The Fridays became a thing. Not every Friday, and not exclusively Fridays, but Friday afternoons after her last class were the anchor of what became a reliable and necessary rhythm. Coffee, or a walk, or occasionally both. Sometimes dinner if neither of us had anything else going on, and neither of us usually did. I knew the names of her students, the ones who asked good questions, and the ones who were genuinely afraid of the dark, and the 3 or 4 who were going to do something interesting with their lives if anyone paid enough attention early enough. She knew the names of the bridges I worked on and which ones I was worried about, and which one had a design flaw in the original 1987 plans that nobody had caught because nobody had been looking for it until I was. We knew each other the way you know someone when you spend a significant portion of your Friday afternoons with them for over a year, which is, as it turns out, quite well. What I also knew, and had known for some time, was that I was in love with her in the specific and not particularly subtle way that makes a person think about someone when there is no particular reason to, and check their phone in the middle of tasks that do not require phone checking and find themselves glad for Thursday, because Thursday is the day before Friday. I had known this for probably 8 months. I had not said it for 8 months, for reasons I had organized into a very coherent internal argument that included the value of the friendship and the risk of miscalculation, and the fact that I was not certain she felt the same way, the last of which was the honest reason, and the others of which were the reasons I told myself, in order to make not doing anything feel like a considered decision rather than a failure of nerve. She gave me no clear signal that she felt the same way. She also gave me no clear signal that she did not, which is the particular territory that people who have decided not to examine something too closely tend to inhabit, and which I had been inhabiting with considerable expertise for 8 months. The previous 6 weeks had been different in a way I had noticed and not addressed. She had been slightly more careful with me, which is not the right word, but is the closest I can get to it. Slightly more considered in what she said and how she said it. There were 2 Friday afternoons where the conversation went somewhere and then pulled back from where it was going, and both times I felt it happen and neither of us said anything about it, and both times I drove home afterward with a specific low-level hum of something unresolved sitting in my chest that I recognized as a message I was choosing not to open. The previous Friday she had said something about how she thought she was done being patient about things she wanted, which she said in a general way, but which landed in the specific way of a sentence directed at someone in particular. And I had said, "That sounds right," and she had said, "I think it is," and the conversation had moved to other things. And I had driven home and sat in my apartment and thought about her sentence for a long time, and on Friday night I decided I was going to do something about this, and on Saturday morning I got in my car. I had not texted her before I drove over. This was partly because I was not entirely sure what I was going to say, and did not want to compress it into a text, and partly because I had a dim awareness that if I told her I was coming, she might tell me not to come, and I was not ready to be told not to come. This was not the most rational approach I had ever taken to anything. I am, professionally, a person who plans. I plan load tolerances and drainage systems and the sequencing of construction phases in ways that account for contingencies I have not yet encountered. I had not planned this at all, which was either evidence that something important was happening or that I had lost my professional habits, along with my personal sense of proportion, and I was sitting in the car working this out when my phone screen lit up with her name. "We need to talk." I looked at the text. I looked at her building. I looked at the text again. She had sent it at 9:47. It was now 9:48. I had been sitting outside her building for 11 minutes before she sent it, and I had not texted her, and she had not texted me, and yet here we both were. Her inside deciding to do something and me outside having already started to. I stayed in the car for another 40 seconds, which felt much longer. Then I texted back, "I'm outside your building." She did not respond for 32 seconds. I counted them. Then she texted, "Outside as in, on the street?" I texted, "Parked." There was a pause of about 15 seconds, and then my phone rang. I answered. She said, "Why are you parked outside my building?" I said, "I was going to come up." She said, "When?" I said, "I was working up to it." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable exactly, but was dense with something. Then she said, "How long have you been out there?" I said, "About 12 minutes now." She said, "12 minutes." I said, "I was preparing." She said, "For what?" And I thought about the 14 months and the 8 months and the previous 6 weeks and the Friday sentence about being done being patient. And I said, "I was going to tell you something." She was quiet. Then she said, "Come up." I came up. She opened the door of her apartment on the 4th floor before I finished knocking, which suggested she had been standing close to it. She was wearing weekend clothes, a soft gray pullover and dark green corduroy trousers and no shoes, and her dark hair was down and slightly less arranged than it usually was when I saw her on Fridays, which I noted with the specificity of someone who had been paying close attention to this person for 14 months and knew the difference between her Friday self and her Saturday morning self. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has a version of the next 10 minutes running in her head and is checking whether the reality in front of her matches it. I was wearing a jacket over a dark t-shirt and dark jeans, and I had clearly driven over without any preparatory process beyond the 11 minutes of sitting in the car, which was visible in my general appearance. She said, "Come in." I came in. Her apartment was warm in the way of someone who keeps their heat at a reasonable temperature because they think about other people's comfort, which I knew because I had been in her apartment enough times to know this about her. There were papers on the kitchen table, some kind of lesson planning she had been doing that morning. The good coffee maker she had bought in October was on the counter. The small cactus she had named Gerald was on the windowsill. I knew this apartment the way I knew all the details of her that I had been accumulating for 14 months and using to understand a person rather than to tell them that I understood them, which is a distinction that matters. She said, "Do you want coffee?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Okay." And we stood in her kitchen for a moment in the way people stand when the conversation has not yet started, but is clearly about to. She had not told me what we needed to talk about. I had not told her what I had driven over to say. We were both in possession of information the other person did not have, and we were both about to produce it. She spoke first. She said, "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for about 2 months, and I haven't found the right way, so I'm just going to say it plainly." She looked at me. She said, "I'm in love with you, and I've been in love with you for a while, and I think you might feel something similar, and I think we've both been very careful about this for a very long time, and I'm done being careful about it." She said the last part with the particular directness of someone who has rehearsed the beginning of a sentence many times and is less certain about where it ends. Then she looked at me and waited. I stood in her kitchen in my jacket and my dark jeans, and I said, "I drove over here to say the same thing." She looked at me. She said, "What?" I said, "I was parked outside your building because I was going to come up here and tell you that I've been in love with you for approximately 8 months, and that I've been not doing anything about it for most of that time, for reasons. That seemed good when I invented them, and now seem like the least interesting reasons I've ever had." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "You were going to say this." I said, "That was the plan." She said, "You were sitting outside for 12 minutes, and you were going to come up here and say that." I said, "I needed to organize it." She said, "You needed to organize telling me you love me." I said, "I'm an engineer. We have processes." She looked at me, and then she started to laugh. Not politely, but genuinely. The laugh that starts in her chest and arrives without ceremony. The one I had been noting in my internal catalog of her for 14 months, and which I had, now that I had finally said what I was doing with that catalog, earned the right to simply love. She said, "You texted me back that you were parked." I said, "It seemed relevant information." She said, "I sent you 'We need to talk' because I thought you were going to need to know something happened, and here you were already out there with the same information." I said, "We're on the same schedule apparently." She said, "We've been on the same schedule for 8 months apparently." I said, "Give or take." She said, "That is such an engineer answer." We stood in her kitchen for another moment, and then she said, "Are you going to say it properly or just explain the process?" I said, "I love you." She looked at me. She said, "There it is." I said, "There it is." She said, "I love you too, which you know." And I said, "I know, which I do now." She said, "You knew before." I said, "I suspected before." She said, "You suspected for 8 months." I said, "I was working within a confidence interval." She laughed again and said, "This is the most engineer conversation anyone has ever had in my kitchen." I said, "Would you prefer I express it differently?" She said, "No." She said, "I actually find it somewhat charming, and I've found it somewhat charming for 14 months. And I'd like to stop finding it charming from across a friendship and start finding it charming from a different position." I said, "What position?" She said, "The one where you stop standing on the other side of my kitchen and come here." So I did. What happened after that I will describe with the restraint of someone who understands that the private moments between two people who have been waiting for this moment for 8 months belong to them. But I will tell you that the coffee Priya had been about to make when I texted that I was parked did not get made for quite some time, and that when it did finally get made, Gerald the cactus was still on the windowsill, and the lesson planning papers were still on the kitchen table, and the building was still 6 blocks from her school, and I was still a civil engineer who thinks about what happens underground. And none of these things had changed, and everything had changed, which is the specific alchemy of two people who have been standing in the same place for 14 months, finally deciding to occupy the same space. She told me, later that afternoon, about the 2 months she had spent trying to find the right way to say it. She said she had written several versions of "We need to talk" before she sent the one she sent, which she had written and deleted and rewritten, and ultimately sent on the grounds that it was honest if incomplete, and that she needed to say something before the not saying became its own answer. I said, "I want to know what the other versions said." She said, "They were worse." I said, "Worse how?" She said, "More explaining, less saying." I said, "You chose well then." She said, "You chose the option of sitting outside in a parked car for 12 minutes, so I'm not sure either of us has much standing to critique the other's process." I said, "I organized my thoughts." She said, "You organized yourself into a parked car." I said, "The parked car was part of the process." She looked at me in the particular way she looked at me when I said something that she found simultaneously exasperating and exactly what she expected from me, which I now had specific permission to find important, and she said, "Next time, just come up." I said, "Noted." She said, "I mean it." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "The first time I thought I might be in love with you was the 3rd Friday, when you described the structural failure of a water main using the phrase catastrophic lack of foresight, and I thought, this person is both technically precise and privately furious about poor planning, and that is exactly the kind of person I want in my life permanently." I said, "You've been in love with me since month 2. She said, 2.5. I said, "And you waited." She said, "You weren't ready." I said, "How did you know?" She said, "Because you were still explaining everything to yourself. And I know the difference between a person who has figured out what they feel and a person who is still working out whether what they feel is something they're allowed to feel." I said, "I was working it out." She said, "I know." I waited. I said, "That took patience." She said, "I have a classroom full of 12-year-olds who are afraid of things living without sunlight. I have patience." We went for a walk in the afternoon, 6 blocks through the neighborhood to the coffee place on the corner that had become ours through the specific accumulation of presents, and we sat in the window and had the coffee that had not been made in her kitchen, and I thought about 14 months of Friday afternoons and 8 months of knowing something and not saying it, and 2 months of her writing, "We need to talk" in various forms on her phone, and one Saturday morning of me sitting in a parked car 11 minutes on her street, and a text message, and a phone call, and a kitchen in which we had both arrived at the same place at the same time, and I thought that the specific coincidence of her sending that text at the exact moment I was sitting outside her building was either meaningless or the most meaningful thing that had happened in the entire 14 months, and I decided it was both, which is the answer I always arrive at when I am trying to figure out whether something matters, and which is also, as Priya pointed out when I said this out loud, a completely engineer way of processing a romantic coincidence. I said, "I contain multitudes." She said, "You contain one very specific multitude." And she said it looking at me across the small table, with the expression she had been looking at me with for months that I had been interpreting as friendship and now had permission to interpret correctly. And the coffee was good, and the window was warm, and Gerald the cactus was 6 blocks away on a windowsill in an apartment on the 4th floor of a building. I was now going to start thinking of differently. I told Marcus the next day. He said, "Finally." I said, "You keep saying that." He said, "Because it keeps being true." I said, "She texted, 'We need to talk,' while I was parked outside." He said, "Of course she did." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means you two have been running on the same internal schedule for months, and neither of you was reading the other's clock." I said, "That is either profound or obvious." He said, "Most true things are." I said, "I was parked for 11 minutes. He said, "Was it worth it?" I thought about the kitchen and the laugh and the "we need to talk" and the 12 minutes and the coffee that didn't get made for a while and Priya saying, "Next time, just come up." I said, "Yes." He said, "Then stop analyzing the 11 minutes and go be in love with her." I said, "I'm already in love with her." He said, "I know. Go be somewhere that she can tell." I went back to her building. The car was in a proper parking spot this time, not an 11-minute working up to it situation. She buzzed me in without my having to say who it was, which told me she had been expecting me, which told me she was also running the same schedule I was, which told me that the 11 minutes and the "we need to talk" and the 2 months she had spent trying to say something and the 8 months I had spent knowing something were all part of the same process run by two people who had arrived at the same conclusion by different routes and needed slightly different amounts of time to find the confidence to say it out loud. The process was over. The thing it had been producing was just beginning. That was 4 months ago. She still teaches on the 6th floor with Gerald on the windowsill. I still work underground. The 6 blocks between our buildings have become a distance I traverse, with a frequency that I track without meaning to, and that currently averages about twice the rate of the 14 months before the Saturday, which is not a metric I would typically apply to something personal, but which is the honest measure of the change in the situation. The Friday afternoons are different now, not in structure, but in what lives inside them, which is everything that was always there, plus the permission to be there, which turns out to make a significant difference in how an afternoon feels. She corrects my use of structural metaphors when I apply them to emotions. I ask technically precise questions about marine biology that she answers with the unself-conscious expertise that started all of this. We are, essentially, the same people we were before the Saturday, plus honesty, which is either everything or nothing depending on where you were before it, and we were somewhere that made it everything. She texted me last Tuesday, not "we need to talk," just "the 3rd period class finally stopped being afraid of the dark." I texted back, "What changed?" She texted, "I told them that things living without sunlight had found a different source. The thermal vent kids found a way." I said, "That's a good lesson." She said, "I thought you'd think so." I said, "Because I'm an engineer who thinks about what's underground." She said, "Because you understand that the support structure doesn't have to look like what you expected." I said, "Is that what this is?" She said, "That's what this is." I held my phone for a moment in the way I had held it in the parked car 4 months earlier, looking at the screen and the building and the screen, except this time I was in my apartment on the 7th floor and she was in hers on the 4th, and the 11 minutes were not necessary because I already knew what I was doing when I picked up my keys. I went down 4 floors. She had already started the coffee. There is something I have been thinking about since the Saturday that I have not told Priya yet, not because it is a secret, but because it has not found its moment. What I have been thinking about is the 11 minutes. Specifically, what was happening in the 11 minutes while I was sitting in the car working up to getting out of it. I have described those 11 minutes to myself as preparation, and to Marcus as organizing my thoughts, and to Priya as a process, and all of those descriptions are accurate, but none of them are complete. What was actually happening in the 11 minutes was that I was sitting in a parked car outside the building of the woman I had been in love with for 8 months, having finally decided to do something about it, and finding that the final step between deciding and doing was harder than all of the deciding had been. The deciding had been, in retrospect, easy. The 8 months of not deciding had been easy in the way that avoidance is easy, which is the ease of not doing a hard thing rather than the ease of a thing that is genuinely simple. But the deciding, once I had done it, had not been hard. It had been quiet and clear, the way a load calculation is quiet and clear when the numbers come out right, and you know the structure will hold? I had sat in my apartment on Friday night and thought about her sentence, about being done, being patient, and I had thought about 14 months of Friday afternoons, and about the way she laughed, and about Gerald the cactus, and about the thermal vent kids, and about the word love, and whether I was willing to keep sitting with it in a place she couldn't see it. And the answer that came back was, no, I was not willing to keep doing that. That part had been easy, in the end. The 11 minutes were the bridge between the easy, deciding, and the doing. And bridges, as I know professionally, are the hardest part of any structure. Not because they are more complex than what comes before or after, but because they are the part where something that was on one side has to get to the other side. And the getting across is the whole point. And you have to trust the load calculation. I got out of the car. 14 months of Friday afternoons, and 8 months of knowing something, and 11 minutes of sitting in a parked car, and one text, and one phone call, and a kitchen, and a laugh about confidence intervals. That is the whole structure of it. Every piece was load-bearing, even the 11 minutes. Especially the 11 minutes, maybe, because the 11 minutes were the part where I finally stopped planning the bridge and started walking across it. Priya came back from school last Thursday, and I had made dinner because I knew what time she finished on Thursdays, and I had her spare key, which she gave me in October with the specific casualness of someone who has made a decision and is not going to make a performance of it. She came through the door and I was at the stove, and she dropped her bag by the door and came into the kitchen and said, "You made the pasta." I said, "I know you like it after Thursdays." She stood next to me at the stove and looked at what I was doing and said, "You're going to burn the garlic." I moved the garlic, she said. "A little longer." I gave it a little longer. She said, "Good, now add the wine," and I added the wine, and the kitchen filled with the smell of it. And she leaned against the counter watching me with the expression that I now had 14 months plus 4 months of specific data to understand. And I understood it, and I said, "What?" She said, "Nothing." I said, "It's something." She said, "I'm just glad you got out of the car." I said, "It's been 4 months." She said, "I know, I'm still glad." I said, "I was always going to get out." She said, "I know that too." I said, "You could have texted earlier." She said, "You could have come up sooner." I said, "We've established this." She said, "I just like saying it." I said, "You like being right." She said, "I've been right for 14 months. I'm allowed to like it." The garlic was perfect. The dinner was good. Gerald the cactus was on the windowsill. We ate at the kitchen table that had lesson planning papers on it 4 months ago, and now had space for 2 plates and a bottle of wine, and the specific comfort of a Thursday evening between 2 people who have finally stopped using the distance between them as a place to live. She asked me once, last month, if I had a favorite moment. She meant, since the Saturday, I understood, or maybe since the 14 months, all of it together. I thought about it for a moment, with the genuine consideration of someone who keeps careful track of things and who has a lot of material to work with. I said, "The 11 minutes." She looked at me. She said, "You mean when you were sitting in the car?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because that was the moment I stopped having reasons not to." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I sent the text while you were out there." I said, "I know." She said, "I spent 2 months trying to say something, and then I said it while you were already on your way." I said, "We were on the same schedule." She said, "We've always been on the same schedule." I said, "I know that now." She said, "You knew it before." I said, "I was working within a confidence interval." She smiled, and it was the smile I had been watching for 14 months, and I was watching it from exactly where I should have been watching it from all along, and the coffee was on, and Gerald was on the windowsill, and there was nowhere else I needed to be, and nothing I needed to organize before I could be there. I think about the "we need to talk" text sometimes. Not with any anxiety now, just with the particular fondness you feel for a thing that turned out to be exactly what it needed to be. She had written it in probably 15 other forms before she settled on that one. "We need to talk" is not, on its face, a romantic message. It is the message of a difficult conversation incoming, of something that needs to be addressed, of a reckoning of some kind. She sent it anyway because she had run out of better versions and because, as she said, it was honest if incomplete, and she trusted that if she said enough of the truth in a short enough message, I would understand what the rest of it was. She was right that I would understand. She did not know I would understand from a parked car 11 minutes into sitting outside her building because I had already arrived at the same place she was arriving at from inside. But this is the thing about two people who have been moving toward each other at the same speed from the same starting point. The messages they send each other are always going to arrive at an address the other person is already approaching. I was approaching her address. She was sending me a message to come. We were, as Marcus said, running on the same internal schedule without reading each other's clock. And the "we need to talk" in the parked car were simply what it looked like when both clocks hit the same number at the same time. I do not think this was fate or coincidence or anything supernatural. I think this was two people who had been paying close enough attention to each other for 14 months that when they each independently decided the time had come, the time that had come for both of them was the same time. That is not magic. That is just what it looks like when you have been paying attention. Priya texted me this morning. She does this now, texts me in the morning, not with any particular information, but with the specific generosity of someone who has decided that the other person should know they are being thought of before the day starts. This morning's text was a photograph of Gerald the cactus with the caption, "He's had a good week." I texted back, "What does a good week look like for Gerald?" She texted, "Consistent light, no unnecessary movement, someone paying attention." I texted, "Sounds right." She texted, "I thought you'd think so." I put my phone down and looked at my apartment on the 7th floor of the building, 6 blocks from her school, and I thought about how, 4 months ago, I had sat in a car 1 floor below her and 4 floors below where I was standing right now, and thought about getting out of it. I thought about the load calculation and the bridge and the structure, and I thought about what she had texted about Gerald, and I thought, consistent light, no unnecessary movement, someone paying attention. I have been paying attention for 14 months. I will be paying attention for a long time after. The 11 minutes were the whole thing in miniature, and they were worth every second.